Right, so my name's Tim Patten. I'm from Telveen, so Marcus Finzer is our professor there. And we are a lab that does vision for robotics. I don't know if anyone was here last year, but Marcus gave a lecture. I think perhaps even two. He's busy because we have our own fall school at the moment in Vienna, so he sent me instead. So I hope I can give you some good information about robot perception. So let's start with a robot system. This picture's from the probabilistic robotics book by Thran, Burgard, and Fox. And I hope most people here are familiar with this. So at the heart of a robot system, right, we have this control system which really does all the planning and determines what actions should be performed. What's important, and I think what's been a big topic of the past week, is this world belief or this representation, this knowledge representation. Down the bottom is showing how the robot interacts with the world, so it performs actions, but really importantly, and the focus of this talk is on the perceptual side, so how the robot receives information from the environment, so how it understands how it influences the scene or the environment and exactly what's going on there. So it's a really important part of a robot system. So if we were to take out the perception, right, what can a robot do? So I think in a way you can say that without perception, this world representation starts to dwindle away, that no longer can the robot understand what's happening, no longer can the robot monitor what's happening in the world. And a nice example was given on, when was it? On Wednesday by Amanesh. He showed this example with the woman trying to light the match, having numb fingers. So that's just an example of how, you take out some perception system and all of a sudden the system starts to fail. So perception can come in many different forms, and here are just some typical robots, very complex ones such as a self-driving car, down to a very simple floor cleaning robot. But no matter the system, it has some sort of perceptual capability, so whether that be LiDAR or whether that just be simple wall sensors. And so why does a robot perceive the world? Exactly how does this influence the robotic tasks? And we can break this down into some simple questions. And this is very high level. There are, of course, more, but just want to give you a taste that really, if a robot is out there in the world, one of the important things, or the important things it has to do, is understand where it is, where it should go to, and how it should perform its tasks. So if we think about the question of where am I, this means this problem of localization and mapping. So perception comes in here in terms of finding out where these landmarks are in the scene for any sort of SLAM algorithm to work. When we talk about the question of where do I want to go, of course this is a typical navigation and path planning problem, but it's up to perception to build this workspace to find out where these obstacles are, to find out where the boundaries of where the robot can go. And finally, this sort of more high-level question of how do I do it, in the context of this week, this comes down to detection and manipulation. So finding out where these objects are and how they should be manipulated. But these are all very challenging problems for a robot. So let's just take this for example. This is the same scene captured at different times of the day. So early morning, afternoon, and late at night. So it's not even easy for us to tell that this is the exact same location. So how is a robot supposed to do this? Secondly, if a robot needs to build a map of its environment and figure out where the obstacles are, find out where it should go, it can also be complicated. So look at these very crowded scenes. It's really impossible to model everything that's going on, let alone plan a path here. And lastly, how to do a task. We all have very cluttered environments. So where are the objects? How do I manipulate them? This is all very challenging for a robot. So this talk will focus mostly on this component. So I won't go too much or any detail into the mapping and navigation side of things, because I think the focus here is with cognitive robotics for manipulation. The most important thing is to understand what objects there are in the world and how we can interact with them. So what I'll look at is questions such as what is it? So answering the question of recognition. What type is it? So answering the question of classification. Where is it? So this is object detection. And finally, how do I manipulate it? So this is grasp pose estimation. And the way I want to present this is sort of building from the foundations. So while we're mostly interested in these robotic tasks, I think we need to understand how we get there. So firstly, understanding features coming from all the visual input or the perceptual input, and how we use this in learning frameworks to achieve these tasks. So laying a good foundation, I think, will help to understand all the things that we're mostly interested in. And I hope this sort of helps with the later tutorials and things that happen today. Right, so starting with features, these are really at the heart of most vision applications. So we can roughly divide this into point features and edges. So point features typically used for problems such as alignment, structure from motion, stereo matching, and recognition. And you can see an example down on the bottom left here. So this is just a transform image, and you can find these features to find exactly what this transformation is. On the other side are edges. So these are typically used in very computer vision applications such as editing, calibration. Also can be used for tasks such as segmentation. So just an example here on the right showing these rich edges that can be extracted from images. So going into a bit more detail, so what do I mean by point features? Well, these are a sparse set of informative locations in an image. So some names you can call these, so key points or interest points. But because they are sparse, they're actually very good for our perception problems because they are quite robust to clutter and occlusion. So even if a part of an object is cluttered, we can still find enough features on the part of the object that is visible. Likewise, they scale well. So if we look at a broad scene, because it's sparse, we don't have to compute them densely. We can still get enough information from these sparse points. So here's just an example of a scene captured from two different perspectives and some key points that are extracted there. And you can kind of already see that some points in the image are more informative than others. So picking the sky, for example, as a key point doesn't give a lot of detail. It's much better to find areas which have a lot of contrast and variability, as that's more descriptive of that part of the scene. So edges, on the other hand, they carry more semantic information. So edges represent things like boundaries, occlusion, and surface changes. So where the color or illumination tends to change. So edges are simple, but they can be grouped together to create more informative structures such as curves, contours, or lines. So here's just an example of finding out these strong contrast points or locations in these images where we can construct these types of representations. So these, I think, features are really, really important for most of our perception tasks, and I'll go through how features can be used to do object recognition. So there are a number of stages. You can describe this as detection, description, and matching. So detection is finding out where these informative places in an image are. Description is creating some descriptor to represent what this pixel or patch means. And finally, matching is used when looking at a sample image and a test image and trying to find the correspondences. So this is also used for the problem of tracking, which is a slight modification to recognition where this search space for these matches is in a local vicinity. So there are many, many, many different features. If you look at any computer vision textbook, there will be long descriptions, but one of the most robust, strongest ones that still works today, despite all the advancements in deep learning, is SIFT. So the scale invariant feature transform. So I think it's very important to understand this feature, as I'll sort of build upon this later on. So in terms of the detection, this is finding out which parts of the image are important. How SIFT works, what it does, it creates a scale and a blur space. So it replicates an image at different scales called octaves, and then it applies blur at different levels. So you can see what's going on here, scale across the X and blur across the Y. And blur is achieved by just convolving this image with a Gaussian filter. So what SIFT does then, it looks at, say, one octave, so one scale of image size, and computes the differences between these Gaussian images to create what's called these difference of Gaussian images. And so here's just an example. Okay, it's not very visible there, but there are, maybe you can slightly see there are little white patches here that start to represent parts of the image that have strong contrasts, that are carrying a bit more information than the black parts. Right, and so then looking at these parts that were white before, simply finding these important key points is done just by finding local minima and local maxima. So that is a single pixel where all surrounding pixels are either lower than or larger than. So this becomes a key point in the SIFT detection pipeline. And so just an example here, once again, not very visible, but maybe you can see some slight speckledy parts here showing where these key points are found. Right, so once these key points are found, then the job is to describe them, and to describe them well so that they can be matched between images. And so what SIFT does, it creates a histogram of orientations. So what that means is it looks at this key point, it takes a 16 by 16 window around it, and then it computes all the gradients in all the pixels in this window. So these gradients are computed by convolving this image with a filter. So down the bottom you can see, applying a horizontal kernel or a vertical kernel, you can extract the changes of the intensity in these two directions, and combining these, you can determine the magnitude and the gradient of the intensity change in the image. So then this is accumulated in what's called this orientation histogram by taking the 16 by 16 window, sort of shrinking it down to a 4 by 4, where each subregion sums up or sort of accumulates all the little gradients in the larger window. And this put together creates this SIFT feature vector. Right, and so SIFT is, scale invariant, is the scale invariant feature transform, and so it achieves invariancy through a few different techniques. So one, to achieve orientation invariancy, it just simply rotates everything with respect to the dominant orientation. So finding the orientation of the key point itself, and then orientating every single, let's say, pixel gradient with respect to that dominant gradient of the key point. And lastly, it does some thresholding and normalizing to achieve invariance to the illumination or the intensity values. Right, then finally, to use SIFT to do object recognition, it just comes down to a matching problem. So just measuring the Euclidean distance between different feature vectors. This can be done simply with a KD tree, for example. And so, right, so to remind you what we're doing here, so this is recognition, so finding the exact object in one image that's found in another image. So just an example of what this looks like. So we have some scene, and then there are some little patches that have been extracted. They're slightly transformed, different scale, different orientation, but they can be refound in the image. So you find all these, you find many of these correspondences in the bottom image here. But to actually do the recognition is not just finding matching key points. They all have to agree, right? So these key points need to be grouped. A Huff transform is applied, then some affine transformation is found by performing linear least squares. Okay, so there can be many hypotheses generated just from the matching stage, but these need to be pruned, and they need to agree in order to get a proper recognition of an object. And so here's just another example, and I think the point of this example is to show how it still works with very strong occlusion. So here's just a truck and a frog. But you can see that this frog is really occluded. You can only see about half of the frog, but there's still enough features left on the nose and on the leg to still get a very good recognition result. Okay, so that's a simple run through of how recognition can perform on 2D images, but there is a whole other dimension out there, the third dimension. So, and this is something that as roboticists we exploit quite a lot. So 2D can get us quite far, but 3D really helps. So how do we represent 3D data? So there are a few different ways. So firstly, we can simply represent this as a depth image, where every pixel in the image measures the distance to the camera. 3D data can be represented as a point cloud. So this is a set of points where each point is some coordinate, so an x, y, z value. Could be a mesh, which is a point cloud with edges. So these edges connect points to create what's called a surface or a manifold. And lastly, this can be represented as a voxel grid, so where each element is a volume that represents occupied or free space. Okay, and so like 2D features, there are also the equivalent 3D features. But instead of looking at color or intensities, 3D features look at the geometric information, so things like distances, normals, and curvature. And to-do recognition follows a very similar pipeline, so detection, then description, then matching. And there are various descriptors here. So what I will do, I'll focus on one. I'll focus on the ESF feature, and just to change it up a bit, I'll look at not the recognition task, but actually classification, so a little bit more general. So ESF stands for Ensemble of Shape Functions, and so even in the name, it's saying that it represents the shape of an object, so it's representing the geometry. So I won't go into the detection stage because in the classification part, we're sort of assuming that we have some nicely segmented point cloud. But what's important is the description stage. So similar to SIFT, it builds a histogram where each bin represents some form of geometry, basically. And this is comprised of angles, areas, and distances. So the way SIFT works is that given a point cloud, many points are sampled. So triplets are sampled and pairs are sampled. So for every triplet that is sampled, the angle and the area enclosed by these two lines or the triangle can be computed. And for every pair that is sampled, just simply the distance between these 2 points is computed. And there's also something called the distance ratio, which looks at not just the distance between these points, but looks at the ratio of how much of this line is on the object and versus how much is off the object. Now for each of these measures, let's say the angle, areas, and distances, they are also further categorized into this on-off mixed type, which, like the distance ratio, measures how much of these lines are on the object, how much are off, and how much is sort of mixed. Right, so this gives 3 categories for each area, angle, and distance. Together there are 10 types of measures here, and this is all pulled together into a really giant histogram of 640 elements. So finally, to do this classification, just like SIFT, we have to have some database of objects. Here, for 3D classification, we have some big database of CAD models, let's say, and these are all put together into certain categories to make things a little more robust or stronger. Different views are taken for the models so that they are also pulled together to have different representations of this object to be able to deal with the 2.5D data that actually comes from a real sensor. And finally, matching is similar to SIF, just finding how histograms overlap. So simply computing the L1 distance over the histogram, and this can be also done through k nearest neighbor. So simply using ESF, I think results look quite good. So you can see on the diagonal of the confusion matrix that there are, it works pretty well. Everything is classified quite well. There are some failure cases, or not failure cases, so some parts where it's weaker. But I think that's actually quite interesting. So if you look at the most confusing classes, that is the toilet paper and the mug, it kind of makes sense, right? These two types of objects are round, they have a big hole in the middle. So I think it's good that we can see that it works well, but also where it fails, that it tends to make sense. But in this context, we can see that it's really representing the geometry of the object. So, toilet paper and mug don't have similarity in the color space, but in the geometric space, they certainly do. All right, so back to the drawing board. So features, I said, are really important, and this is used not just for recognition and classification like I explained, but a variety of other tasks. And then I sort of touched a little bit on learning, so I showed how using SIFT and ESF can be put together in just to learn something about objects using k nearest neighbor. So this is a very, very simple learning algorithm, but there are more sophisticated algorithms such as SVMs, boosting, decision trees. But of course, you know, what's really happening these days is that everyone's applying deep learning, right? So I will focus on that rather than going through some of these shallow learning techniques, because I think really if we want really good performance, we should really understand what's happening in deep learning. So deep learning now is, one of the most powerful machine learning algorithms that we have, and we can see really remarkable results in so many different perception and visual tasks. But it's been around for quite some time. Way back in the 1940s, people were researching neural networks, but it's really only in the last, say, 10 years when we're actually starting to see the great performance, and that's due to finally having great, powerful GPUs, so having the computational power to sort of support all this training. We also have data sets large enough to train all the parameters that these networks have. And lastly, there's been some great advances, especially in the backpropagation algorithms, to really enable networks to be trained. So 5-10 years ago, an LSTM couldn't be trained for anything more than very, very simple tasks, but now we can see this doing really complex things and making quite long-term predictions. So the breakthrough came, I would say, really when AlexNet just blew away the ImageNet competition in 2012. So ImageNet is a really huge database of images for the classification tasks. So in 2006, it started to be collected, and then in 2010, this ImageNet classification challenge began. So in the first 2 years, there were quite good results. So error rates of 25 to 30%. But then in 2012, AlexNet just really blew away the competition. So achieving an error rate of 15%, which was more than 10% better than any runner-up. And as time has gone on, this has improved even more. So nowadays, these networks outperform us humans at classifying objects. So to explain deep learning, let's just have a very quick overview of machine learning. So what is machine learning? Well, it's just the task of learning from and making predictions on data. So very simple. What that means as programmers, we build a model to approximate some unknown function. Now, deep learning is just a subfield of machine learning, and what it does, it uses artificial neural networks to make these predictions. But an important difference between deep learning and machine learning is shown here. So I discussed actually before, how we extract features, and then these can be put together in some learning algorithm to generate some output given some input. Now what deep learning does, it kind of takes over this feature extraction stage, and it's combined with the actual the classification or the learning part of it, so the self-supervised learning part of it together, so that it kind of encapsulates everything that needs to transform this input to the output prediction. But let's not forget about these features that I explained before. So cast your mind back to what I said about the SIFT descriptor. So it had a few different stages there. So what was happening with SIFT, right? So the image comes in, some filters are applied to find these gradients. There was some pooling action to create these histograms. There was some normalization at the end, finally to output this feature vector. So if we look at a convolutional block, it very much follows the same pattern. So in the beginning, there's some convolution to sort of learn some description. There's some non-linearity component here, but then this is basically pooled spatially, and then finally some normalization happens, and the output is some feature map. So you can see here there's actually some nice correspondences of what's happening in deep learning as it relates back to traditional handcrafted features. So we're not completely lost when we're designing a model to do some recognition tasks. There is some grounding in the traditional methods that we've learnt about or developed in the past. So I believe it's it's really important to first understand traditional computer vision in order to do deep learning, because I think that understanding will help us really advance what we can do with these more powerful learning algorithms. Right, so let me go through what this convolutional layer does. So imagine we have some image, and then we also have this little kernel. So it's a very small size, and what convolution means is that this kernel is just slid across this image, and at every position it computes some dot product between these pixel intensity values, let's say, and every element in this kernel. So here's just an example of, at this kernel, at one position in the image, take some dot product between it and all the image pixels that it's overlapping to compute some number here. So then sliding this over at all possible positions in the image produces what's called the activation map. Of course, given the size of the kernel, this activation map becomes smaller to produce. It just becomes something smaller because it's compressing this data. It's representing this in some latent space now. Now, applying one convolutional layer doesn't really get us very far, so maybe we get some representation, but the power of CNNs, of these larger architectures, is to stack these together to generate richer and richer and richer features. So the activation maps get smaller and smaller and smaller, but they have much more representative power of that image in the first place. And then I mentioned before on that diagram that a convolutional block has this convolution part and also has this normalization block at the end. And basically what this is just the spatial pooling, like what was happening in SIFT. So this is kind of like a downsampling operation. So it transforms some activation map at some size and compresses this into a smaller size. And so this helps make these representations smaller and more manageable. So just an example, so one of the most common pooling layers that people apply is the max pooling layer. So here, simply taking each block and just finding the maximum value in this little subregion. So there are other pooling layers such as averaging, so summing up and dividing by how many pixels, but generally everyone's using max pooling. It's shown to really achieve the best results at the moment. Okay, so how do we do classification with deep learning? So now we're looking at not what it is, but what type it is. So let's go through AlexNet, because being one of the first and best performing algorithms, I think it deserves some highlight. So it's not very complex, to be honest. So if you look at the structure, it's just really simply a set of convolutions and pooling layers. So there is some design in how to do this, how to sort of maintain or think about the size of the activation maps as it goes from the input to the output. But simply it just comes down to these two components that I described, convolutions and pooling. Of course, with all deep learning algorithms, there is some pre-processing that has to happen. So we cannot just shove any size image in. It has to be a certain size to match the input layer to the network. This middle block, what I focused on before, is what's called the feature extraction stage. And as I said before, as we stack convolutions, the features have more representation. So early on, they look like edges, they look like blobs, but the later layers, they start to represent texture, even objects. And finally, at the end, with most CNNs, there is some classification stage, which is made up of the fully connected layers and the softmax layer. So the fully connected layer is what really does this learning part. It does the discriminative learning in this self-supervised learning context. So then what a fully connected layer is, as the name says, it's fully connected, so every neuron from the input is connected to every neuron of the output. And then finally, the softmax layer just squashes all of this output into the multi-class probabilities. So AlexNet is from 2012, and since then there's been many advances, but really they all come back down to the same similar architecture. So series of convolutions and pooling layers, and at the end fully connected layers and then a softmax layer. So here are just some examples from the VGG architectures, but simply you can see convolutions and max pooling, nothing more than that. But what the research has really shown over the years is that to get better performance, it's generally achieved by having deeper networks. So having more layers introduces more non-linearities, which means that the image can be better represented for these non-linear tasks that we're trying to achieve. But if we start to increase the length of the architecture, we do run into a problem of reducing our receptive field to something really tiny. So the idea actually in these more modern architectures is to use smaller filters so that each stage the activation maps don't shrink too fast. So in the end, to maintain the same size of the receptive field, that is the prediction layer, but to have more non-linearities because there are more stages from the start to the finish. What this also achieves is fewer parameters, which means less data is needed to train these models. Okay, so as I went through in the first part with features, there are 2D features, there are 3D features. Similarly, in deep learning, we can look at 2D data and 3D data. So one of the simplest ways to apply a CNN to depth data is to actually convert that depth image into a 3-channel RGB image. So simply, you can take the surface normals, so the XYZ components, and just fit this into the RGB channels. It can be a little better by measuring physical properties. So the HHA feature by Gupta measures height, for example, and then this is packed into an RGB image. Or there can be some direct encoding methods, so something by Andreas Eitel. So this is one method to convert depth information into a RGB image, so that you can just basically piggyback off any CNN trained on an RGB dataset. So you can simply just apply AlexNet on this. Results are not great. It needs to be fine-tuned because there's a bit because the input is a bit different. But this is one of the very simple ways to do it. But of course, we can actually think about these data representations that I talked about before and actually create CNN architectures that use this instead of images. So using voxels or using points. So VoxNet is one such architecture that looks at these 3D volumes, and it has a 3D CNN basically. So the kernel is slightly different because there's an extra dimension in the input. Likewise, PointNet, it's very, very popular for many tasks such as recognition, classification, segmentation, and this takes as input the points themselves, so the XYZ components. And there's some design in the kernels and the structuring, but really, there are various ways to use 3D data for deep learning. But one of the problems actually with these more advanced architectures is that they rely on these fixed structures and they rely on these coordinates. So they tend to lose this invariance to orientation. So one way to get around this is to train on particular views. So basically duplicating, some class and training on all different perspectives, and then, grouping these views into one class. So this works well, but if you can imagine that now we have to train over different views, that the number of parameters really explodes. So an alternative is to learn what's called a spatial transformer network. So this learns how to do the transformation from this input to arbitrary orientations. But unfortunately, these can be quite sensitive. So, they rely on a few different tricks to get working quite well. But in the end, it's like an extra cog in a system. With more moving parts, things become a bit more brittle. So some work that we've been looking at is to do this classification in 3D, but to sort of maintain this orientation invariancy, but avoiding having to train on views and avoiding a transformer network. So the way we looked at this is to decompose our objects into parts, and where each part is then transformed into a local reference frame, so similar to SIFT, to have this spatial invariancy. So, like I've shown before, it has the feature extraction stage. It also has this classification stage. But what we do, so since we have some structure in our information, so we have these parts and parts have neighbors, what we do is actually do some graph convolution. So we actually not only learn the features themselves, but we learn the structure of these components in the object. Alright, so this graph convolution enables us to learn information about neighbors, and this gives the entire architecture even more representation power. And so, like I said before, so these parts that are extracted from the objects, we transform these into what's called a local reference frame, so similar to SIFT. And so this means that the predictions are invariant to the orientation that the object comes in. And lastly, another advantage. In the graph convolution, what's inside there? It's quite complicated. So basically, the graph has a bunch of different nodes, and these represent the parts that are input, and then it has edge information, so neighbor information. So basically, what we do here is we create the graph, and then we create edges between parts by moving around the surface of the object to find some distance. So not Euclidean distance, but distance in the surface. And then we use this information. So that's all that needs to be input there. Then we use this in the graph convolution to start to understand the structure. So given many different examples, we can find some commonality between parts and how they are structured on an object surface. So that's what's going on in there. So we're not just learning the features themselves for these different parts, but learning exactly how they interact together and creating what's called, this graph. Okay. And so maybe to point out the last thing here is that, having this information about a graph and having these parts themselves, it can be much more robust to scale and occlusion. So you can imagine if part of this object is occluded, so let's say we miss or we lose one or two parts, there's still a lot of information in the rest of the structure, and that enables this to be quite strong against any occlusions that happen. Yep. Yeah. So it's sort of heuristic. So basically, it's all randomly sampled. So given a giant database of objects, we don't impose too much restriction. It's more or less random. But so first, the seed points are randomly sampled, very simply, and then just a like a region growing algorithm is applied to here, and we just maintain the angle, the average angle, let's say, as we grow this region, and once that hits some threshold, then we stop growing. So in the end, we generate patches that are quite smooth and continuous in terms of the curvature. But the power comes in due to the fact that it is randomly sampled. So, if we have thousands of objects from one class and we randomly sample this, it doesn't really matter how we sample the test object. We should cover this space. So long as we're diverse enough in our training, we can cover exactly what's going to happen in the real world at test time. And to point that out, so we're testing on CAD models, so this is artificial data, but it enables us to test in the real world. So we generally do tests, so doing the transfer from ModelNet to ScanNet. And so, we can show that it works very well. So we can train everything in simulation, and then we can deploy it in the real world. Of course, results are not as good as testing on artificial data, but they're still generally quite good. And so what we're trying to do with this is, have a robot out there that can observe its environment, classify objects, and then retrieve models from this model net. So finding the nearest model to the segment that it finds, and then we can actually start to construct these twin worlds. So constructing an artificial world from the real scene online. And so these images, I don't know if you're familiar with the Facebook replica dataset, but that's sort of similar in spirit, trying to observe what's happening and then recreate an artificial version of that, in which we can apply all the things that I guess we've learnt in the last week. Okay, so let me now move on to another task, and that is detection. Okay, so answering the question, where is it? Where is this object? And so this is simply shown here, finding these bounding boxes over every object in the scene. Simultaneously, actually, most of the methods also do the classification on them. So detection really encapsulates where the object is and what it is or what type it is. So one of the first works to do this was RCNN, or Region CNN, by Ross Gishik. And it's quite simple. So what happens here is that the image is taken, and then some method is used to generate some regions of interest. This doesn't use deep learning. This just uses a very simple selective search algorithm. Then these patches are warped, and then they are fit into separate CNNs to extract some features. And finally, these features are used to do classification, but at the same time to do bounding box regression, just to tighten these the corner points of the bounding box. And here actually it uses a simple SVM to do the classification, doesn't use softmax or anything. But that was the first generation. Then, of course, there's been later generations such as fast RCNN, faster RCNN. So fast RCNN does actually use a softmax layer instead of an SVM. It also makes some changes by not doing the region of interest selection, but passing the image into a ConvNet and then from that extracting the regions of interest. Faster RCNN, makes even further advances, trying to reuse as much information from the initial CNN from those activation maps and not having to recompute them at different stages. So that's a very simple overview of what state of the art is for object detection. But I think I wanted to have that explained to get into what's actually really happening these days, which is not just giving a bounding box of the object, but finding out what pixels belong to it. So this is doing not just detection, but doing the segmentation. So, and as I showed before, there was this example with these rings and the object, the robot manipulator. But these methods are applied, outdoor for self-driving cars to really get crisp masks around all the objects that are in the image. So state of the art these days is mask RCNN. So this is something that builds on the prior work of these RCNN networks, and it's called mask RCNN because it also predicts the mask of the object. So it achieves this by not really modifying the architectures too much. All it does is add an extra branch to the final output to predict the mask. So it still does the classification, it still does the bounding box regression, but in addition, it does some mask prediction. And one of the troubles with actually doing pixel-wise segmentation is that you tend to lose some spatial alignment. So because there's a number of pooling layers that happen, and you can imagine that this image is just changing shape, it's being transformed, it's being warped. So mask-RCNN introduces the region of interest alignment layer to try to preserve these spatial locations. And so here are just some results taken from their paper. You can see the bounding boxes, there is a label to show what class these objects are, and then also the masks. Yep. Yeah. So the COCO dataset has this. So there are datasets. Yeah. Listen, it's very difficult. It's um, but I guess you have to remember that most of these networks, they're not being trained from scratch. So they are trained on the ImageNet dataset first to build up some strong backbone for this, and then they are generally fine-tuned. So what that means is that we need less data for this fine-tuning. We're just doing some sort of domain transfer, let's say. But yeah, it is a huge problem, talking about all the wonderful advances of deep learning. One of the biggest problems is actually getting this data to train these networks. And like you said, hand labeling this is time consuming, but there are data sets out there. I guess one of what people are looking at now is creating synthetic data so that we don't have to label it themselves. But this just changes the problem of, not classification or segmentation, whatever, but changes the problem to domain transfer. But that's just one method to get around it that's happening these days. And I think we saw some work yesterday, really showing how you can make very realistic, sort of photorealistic images and also depth data to be able to do this. All right, so the last part I want to go over now is the manipulation. So I think this is the sort of high level goal that we're trying to achieve, So if we can understand the objects in the environment, finally we can do something with that object. So not just know what it is, where it is, but actually interact with it. And so this comes down to manipulation and grasping. So a very simple pipeline to do this is to take an image, estimate the pose of the object, and if we have some 3D model and we've annotated that with how to grasp it, we can simply, multiply, just do some sort of chain our transformations from the manipulator frame of reference to the object frame of reference to the estimated pose to get the grasp pose in the test scene. And so that's really sort of what's happening now, with people doing pose estimation. They can simply apply this to the robotic case. So this is from CVPR, dense fusion. So on the left, you can see just examples of doing the pose estimation. So the points represent the 3D model points. And on the right, you can see the robot grasping it. So if you focus on the little image here, you'll see a small flicker of colored points right there, and that shows the pose estimation, and that is used in the system to actually do the grasping. So, I think one of the proxies to actually achieving good grasping capabilities is to have good methods to do pose estimation of objects. Right, so how does this work? So either an RGB or a depth image is used as input. Then this is passed to some detection stage. So this could be faster RCNN or something else, something even better. And then this is passed to the CNN architecture. But what's important to remember here is that pose estimation is typically trained per object. So we have one pose estimation network for this object, and we have another model for this object and another one for this. So we use the output of the detector to basically select which model to sort of load into our architecture. So this is trained, of course, on some data set. And finally, the CNN architecture sort of outputs some representation of pose. So this can be the corner points of a bounding box, for example. It could be the quaternion. But no matter the method, generally it can be to get the 6D pose, that is the full translation orientation, we need some sort of correspondence to the 3D model. So typically this is passed into the PNP algorithm. And finally, this outputs the pose. So, of course, pose estimation is not perfect, and most of these methods are boosted by doing some refinement. So this could be as simple as ICP, let's say, using the 3D model in the depth image, or it could be something a bit more sophisticated, using physics simulation, for example. Okay, and of course, it works for, many objects in a scene. So long as we can get good detections of these objects, we can estimate the pose for every object in the scene. Okay, so this is something that we have been looking at, so using this in our system, but what we've sort of noticed is that while pose estimation is good, it's not perfect. So what we actually do is sort of exploit this in a visual serving up system. So using the pose estimator to estimate some homography of the reference image for a intensity-based visual serving system. So what this enables us to do, since pose estimation is not, it's not so fast, getting these predictions from a network. This is not really at the quality of 50 hertz that's needed for really robust visual tracking. So we have some state machines to include this information, but we do manage to have quite good performance to not only get to a very accurate pose, but also to be able to adjust to any changes in the environment. So it enables us to grasp objects that are moving still. Okay, finally, and it grasps it. Okay. But one of the problems here is that an object model needs to be known. So pose estimation, like I said, is trained per object. But if we really want to have a robot work in an open set world, we don't have models for every object there. So how do we grasp objects that are not really known precisely? That is, we don't have a 3D model. Well, once again, we can just throw more data at that, and so we can generate lots of examples. Maybe this is in simulation, but so long as we can sort of have enough diversity in our data, our model should be robust to be able to be applied to novel objects. And so if anyone's sort of doing grasping work, I guess one of the biggest advances has been the work by Jeff Mahler with the establishment of the DexNet dataset, so a huge database of objects. And what they show is that they can use this to train CNNs to grasp unknown objects quite well. So simply, once again, convolutions and pooling layers to learn some function to rank how good sampled grasp poses are in a scene. So this is one way to get to the point of grasping unknown objects, but it's still not perfect, right? This training data has to have some alignment with the observed data. And so even though results are sort of in the 80% mark, it's still not in the 100% mark, which is what we kind of need. Grasping is one of those cases where if you fail, it could be quite catastrophic to the task. If you fail to grab the glass and it falls out, it will smash. So to try to really robustify this, we've been looking at few-shot learning for unknown objects. So what we do is sort of start with a typical network, let's say the GQCNN by Mahler, to make predictions on grasp poses for objects in the scene. And then we try to boost this by introducing some experience based on objects that we know some information about. So In this case, this is an object, let's say, that we have a model of, so we can actually just use the 3D model to sort of refine what the grasp predictor does. But the interesting case is when we have an unknown object and how we exploit both paths of this pipeline. So what we actually do here is we use a pose estimator, but one that's based on templates and one that does non-rigid refinement. So what this enables us to do is to find a similar object that we have a pose of, and we can sort of use some of this information to refine what the predictor does. So maybe it's not the first pose that it predicts, maybe it's some pose that has a lower ranking, but because we have some information about some similarities, some experience, we can sort of modify exactly which one is chosen. And then this can be quite general, so we can observe other objects, similar but different, and we can feed this back into our sort of experience part, but we can also feed this back into our pose estimation part. So because we have a pose estimator that requires templates, it doesn't need 3D models, so we can expand our template set to keep track of everything that is new. And lastly, instead of just using robot experience itself, we can actually modify what grasps makes sense. So maybe the grasp predictor itself doesn't really understand that a drill should be grasped by the handle or a mug should be grasped by the handle. So we can actually inject this information, what's called task-oriented grasping, just by observing humans. And so like robot experience, human experience can also boost our system to achieve semantic grasping. Okay, so good. So there's 4 minutes left. So I have a short wrap up, which will 2 minutes. So I think just very quickly to go over what I talked about. So I looked at perception tasks, the recognition task, the classification task, the detection task, and the grasping task. But I just want to finish with some open challenges because I think it's really important to sort of think about the future and what we'll have to encounter. So one of those is simply robot data. Data coming from robots is very different from data coming from data sets. So this is some work done by one of my colleagues, and what he did was he trained some models on standard data sets, so computer vision data set, web data set, and you can see that these have very good performance, 80% plus class accuracy. But the same models trained on just very regular robot data achieves 40 to 50%. So there is a huge gap between, applying these methods that are trained on computer vision datasets and in the real world. And in the bottom graph, this shows these models trained on the computer vision dataset or the web dataset and then deployed on the robot dataset. And so we cannot at the moment rely on just deploying AlexNet or VGG or ResNet to work in the real world on a robot. There's a huge gap that needs to be overcome. And when we sort of analyze this data, we see that there are problems in the lighting, scaling, background occlusion, clutter, motion blur. So these all badly influence our predictions. So a second point is how we deal with multiple modalities. So I looked at methods that use RGB or depth. I didn't really go into methods that look at RGB and depth at the same time. Because it's not really a solved problem yet, so we've done some work to try to boost the performance from multiple modalities, but really it's not there yet. So just looking at this column, you can see that RGB, between 80 and 90%, depth is kind of varied depending on the quality of the depth. But when you combine it together, the performance isn't a really great boost. So we're not at the moment not really exploiting the information or really complementing the information from different modalities well enough. And the last one is this closed world assumption. So, I think a large majority of researchers are really looking into this very closed world assumption. So where we know everything, we know the data distribution, But really, our world is not full of known knowns. There are also unknown objects, but if we know about them, it makes the task slightly easier. So if we know that our models is trained on cats and dogs, but we know it's not trained on cows and fish, okay, there are some methods to overcome this. But the real problem is how we deal with these unknown unknowns. So when we don't know what our models is always trained on and how to manage our predictions. So if we just look at standard methods, take this scene for example. There's a sheep on the road, and just standard application of this semantic segmentation shows that with high confidence it classifies this sheep as sidewalk, human, and street. So this is something that I think is really open at the moment, that we need to solve to have robust systems, safe systems. Okay, so this is the last slide. So thanks to my team in Vienna, and thank you all for your attention.